Now we can tie everything that we've talked about so far with specialization, comparative advantage, and trade. So as we said throughout these chapters right here, we've said that specialization is going to be good for the economy, and we should be focusing in on the tasks that we are the most proficient at. Because specialization and trade do increase production. They occur between people, they occur between nations. It's just one of the economic facts of life that we should be focusing in on the tasks that we are good at. And in order to see this, we are going to go ahead and introduce the idea of the PPF and opportunity cost to show who should be specializing in doing this particular task. And in order for this analysis to work, in order for this model to be a little bit more simplified, we do need to make two underlying assumptions right here. So first of all, we need to go ahead and ensure that trade and specialization are going to be a good thing for countries worldwide. So here, let's go ahead and make two assumptions. Number one, we are going to assume that trade and specialization can be both seen as positive sum type of games. Can be a positive sum game. So a positive sum game just tells us that when people specialize in the task that they are good at, then both parties can win. So a positive sum game, a game in which both parties can benefit. In which both parties can benefit. So in the analysis that we do in this particular chapter, we are going to notice that trade and specialization is going to be a positive sum game. So both parties are going to benefit with trade and specialization. And we don't necessarily have to assume that it's going to be a zero sum game. So it does not have to be a zero sum game. Zero sum game. So a zero sum game is just the opposite of a positive sum game. With a zero sum game, it's a game where someone is going to win and someone loses. A game where someone wins, and others lose. So there is a winner, there is a loser in a zero-sum game. So with our little economic model that we have right here, we're going to assume trade is a positive-sum game and not necessarily a zero-sum game. In the real world, in application, we do notice that trade and specialization can be some type of zero-sum game where some people are going to win and others are going to lose. However, that becomes a little bit more complex, and we will introduce a few more constraints on this sort of model at the end of the chapter. But for now, we are going to assume that the model that we built up, trade and specialization, is a positive sum game and not a zero sum game. So keep that in the back of your mind. The main idea of trade and specialization came from David Ricardo right here, who basically argued against the Accord laws, and he developed comparative advantage and absolute advantage, which are the main drivers of trade, as we're going to see. And then once he did that, he promptly died. So anytime in economics you see a person in these sort of slides right here, you really don't need to know anything about them. I'm not really interested in people or history all too much, so just go ahead and gloss over them. What we are going to be interested in, however, are the terms that Ricardo did come up with: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So absolute advantage is where a country or a person can produce more of a good than another using the same amount of resources. So example of this is, if I can produce or manufacture 10 televisions and you can only manufacture 5 televisions, I have the absolute advantage in producing televisions because 10 is bigger than 5. With absolute advantage, all we care about is the absolute value of how much you can produce. 10 bigger than 5, therefore I have the absolute advantage. Comparative advantage, on the other hand, is where a country or a person has the lower opportunity cost of producing a good than another country or person. So here we need to compare exactly what you're giving up in order to produce an additional good. So example of this is, suppose that in order for me to produce 1 additional television, I need to give up on the production of 2 computers. If you want to produce an additional television, you only need to give up 1 additional computer in this instance, then you have the comparative advantage in making televisions because you notice that your opportunity cost is lower. So taking a look at these two and comparing these two sort of trade terms, which one do you think is going to be the main driver of trade? Which one should we be focusing in on a little bit more? We should be focusing more on comparative advantage. Number one, because it forces us to do a little bit more work, because it focuses in on the opportunity cost. So In order to see who should be specializing or producing which good, we need to focus in on the comparative advantage and not necessarily the absolute advantage. So here, if you have the comparative advantage in making a good, that means you have the lower opportunity cost in producing that good. It means that you should be exporting that good out. You should be specializing in making that good. So these are all synonymous with you have the comparative advantage. And we need to go ahead and calculate out the opportunity cost in order to see that. So here, don't confuse the two because they do mean two completely separate different things. Absolute advantage, you're just comparing the numbers against one another. With comparative advantage, you actually need to go ahead and calculate out the opportunity cost. So all countries can gain from trade if they follow their comparative advantage when we're assuming that trade is going to be seen as a positive sum type of game. So to segue us into the big problem that we need to go ahead and take a look at, we'll do a quick practice problem right here. Explain why the United States imports bananas from Central America rather than growing them domestically. So why does Central America export their bananas out to the United States? It's essentially because they have the comparative advantage in growing bananas. They have the right resources. They have the right mixture of resources, primarily the tropical climate that bananas need to grow. So that tells us that they have the lower opportunity cost in growing bananas. If the United States actually try to grow bananas themselves, they face a very, very high opportunity cost. They'd be giving up on the production of so many other goods, and it's not really worth it for us here in the United States to be producing these bananas. So in this case, we import bananas. The United States imports bananas. Well, Central America, these countries there, they have the comparative advantage, so they are the ones that should be exporting or specializing in the production or manufacturing of bananas themselves. We'll apply this sort of question into a little bit more mathematical form with the big problem that we need to do for this chapter in the next lecture.